Hello, this is Living History with Ted Goldsborough, and today's guests Maryam Phillips and Nolan Atkinson. We're talking about affordable housing in Lower Merion Township. And we're going to start off this segment of the show with finishing up on Ardmore House. Nolan gave us the background, and Maryam, if you'll take over and talk about your involvement with Ardmore House and what it does and who lives there and how much it costs.
Okay, if you are not aware, I am the current president of the board that runs the Ardmore House. So I'm president of Ardmore Housing for the Elderly Incorporated, another nonprofit which is designed to, support Ardmore House solely. And we have a management company that manages this building, which has about 63 apartments within it. It's federally subsidized with Section 202 funding, which I don't think even exists for new programs anymore, but it's been very successful for Ardmore House. And it enables senior citizens of lower income to have their housing costs subsidized by this extra federal funding. The building itself just celebrated its 25th anniversary a couple of years ago, and as Commissioner Atkinson said, he was there to help us celebrate. And it really proves that, if you put the right effort and funding into a building, it still is viable 25 or 30 or 40 years later, as in the case of those other units.
Where does the money come from to make this work if the people who live there don't have much money?
Well, Montgomery County Housing Authority is often the agency that ends up distributing housing vouchers. In our case, we deal directly with HUD with regard to the funding subsidies that come to Ardmore House. And, I guess a key to not just senior citizen income or any income is that you never want to spend more than 30% of your income on your housing. So that's pretty much the level that residents of Ardmore House meet as well. They will never be charged more than 30% of what their income is as senior citizens in order to live here.
And we should point out that this is open to blacks and whites, anybody. There's no racial component to this.
There is, it's completely open. You just have to meet a certain age or ability in order to qualify. The waiting list is always 70 to 80 people long, no matter when you check it. And so it was
a dire need.
It continues to this day, yeah.
Amongst blacks and whites.
Right.
And when I was there on the 25th anniversary, I was able to observe that you saw African Americans and white Americans all living very harmoniously together under the same roof, and all seemed to be extremely happy with their living circumstances.
The first person that I interviewed for this show 3 or 4 years ago was at Ardmore House, a white woman whose family owned a store down on the river, Mill Creek, and when the expressway was built, they lost that. But anyway, it points out that white women can live there too. Now, if a person gets really sick, this is independent living, right? There's no infirmary, so they have to go elsewhere.
Correct. Yeah, this is not an assisted living community. You do really need to be able to live independently in order to live at Ardmore House.
Anything else about Ardmore House before we move on?
I think so.
Thank you both for discussing. Oh, wait.
Oh.
MOI, Moment of Integration. We had a dedication of a historic marker. Was that last year or 2 years ago? I can't remember. A group of people, including Wendell Holland, raised money to put up a historic marker on Ardmore Avenue about the old school. And that's what this is. Maryam was kind enough to come help us one Sunday morning in our planning of how that ceremony was going to work. And I like that photo because they're two friends of mine. All right, now let's move down to Spring Avenue, another section. It's interesting that Spring is such an important street in talking about affordable housing. But this is East Spring. and it's down at Walnut and Simpson. And in 1948, there was a gas station there and a couple of buildings, and I don't know what this was, but there were a couple of stores. And we have, fortunately, thanks to Mrs. Quinn,
Jane Quinn, yes.
of the Ardmore Library, she had these photographs of what was on that site. And Maryam, could you tell us about that?
Well, I think most people will remember the corner that had the laundromat, and right next to it was a storefront that was taken over and made into a community center. And that is where the Gate Library first started in the 1960s. This Gate stood for Get Ahead Through Education, and it was created to address the concern that African Americans were really not represented in school texts or the general history that people were made aware of, and so a collection was developed specifically to identify all of the history of the African American community. And the Gate Library opened in the 60s, and I think we all know today that that collection, once it left this location, was integrated into the Ardmore Library collection and is still exists today. Purchases continue to be made that focus on African American achievement, and so I was happy to find these photos still exist at the library, because it was a very important part of the community.
Who manned that Gate Library? I guess there were volunteers. You didn't have paid people?
I'm not sure. People may have been paid, but not very much. One of the photos of Storytime shows Mrs. Edith Gibbs, who ended up also running the Head Start program that moved up to the Ardmore Library building as well for several years. And then the children's librarian at Ardmore Library came from the Gate Library as well, Pauline Jordan of Ardmore. So it really worked out well for us to be able to accept not just the collection, but the people that made the Gate Library so special.
And a coincidence in Wendell's looking at these pictures was he saw two family members of the Short family. And
I recognized a couple faces as being Short family members, but I was in the wrong generations. So it's funny to see how their older family members actually look very much like the kids I remember.
And Wendell mentioned that one of the Short family members was one of the people who was killed in Vietnam. And then Wendell held that man up as a model, a role model to him. So these pictures, they were taken back in the 60s, I guess, or 70s, 73. And I was remarking that at that time, the quality of cameras wasn't that great. At least for those of us who couldn't afford expensive cameras, but they still show enough that it's interesting. Now on that site, on this site, is today a parking lot for some affordable housing. Can you tell us about that?
These are, I guess, what we call now the Spring Avenue condominiums, and they were also many, many years in coming. I don't think there was the controversy that was expressed for the two earlier developments we talked about, but there was a good deal of site cleanup associated with this particular block, given the gas station, the cleaners. So whenever you're talking about residential development, you need to follow very strict guidelines in terms of cleanup. And so I think that's really what delayed the building of this this development. But Lower Merion Affordable Housing was very involved in bringing this particular development to fruition. So for them.
Okay. Now, were these, I don't quite understand, these were like brought in on trucks or something?
Yeah, I guess you might think of them as prefab units, prefabricated.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a big day when the trucks rolled in, and they were actually stored on the Pico lot, which was empty at that time, and that's where they sat until they were ready to actually be placed on this site.
So homeowners bought these houses too at a
Correct.
subsidized rate.
Yes.
And there's a picture here, which I think is interesting. Of course, I can't. Oh, President George Bush came, I guess, to support affordable housing. It's brought recognition to Lower Merion Township in that process. Now, there are other units of affordable housing. I'm thinking of St. Asaph's Road. Can you tell me about that?
St. Asaph's Road is a single building that operates, I believe, as it's shared housing. So it's a single building with multiple apartments within for senior citizens.
Rentals.
Correct.
And that's kind of overseen by
Lower Merion Affordable Housing.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, we're getting down. We have 2 minutes left. Let's talk about the cobblestone development.
Ardmore Crossing?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So the Pico lot is no longer empty because Ardmore Crossing sits on it. And there was quite a bit of community involvement in that development. It's a public-private partnership. 2 minutes is not enough to go into all of it, but it consists of another senior citizen lower income apartment building plus townhouses, which are predominantly market rate, but 4 or 5 of which were subsidized through another creative process, tax increment financing. So that, I believe, might have been the first effort of tax increment financing in Lower Merion Township in order to make those townhouses available to moderate income families.
We're out of time, but I thank you both very much for coming and enlightening us on this topic. I'm Ted Goldsboro, and this is Living History. We've been talking to Maryam Phillips and Nolan Atkinson, both former Lower Merion Township Commissioners, and we thank them for their service to Lower Merion. Signing off until next time.